Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining. We'll let everybody get logged into the room here and then we'll get started. All right, welcome everybody. All right, well, hello everybody. Welcome to the Equity and Co-Production webinar series. Today's topic is partnership development in co-production. My name is Kristen Tim. I'll be your host for today. I'm a research assistant professor here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks at the International Arctic Research Center, where my work is focused on science communication and actionable science. I'm joining you today from UAF's Troth Yedda campus, which is on a beautiful ridge overlooking the Tanana River Valley. And this is on the ancestral and unceded homelands of the Lower Tanana Dene people. And as a settler here, I'm very grateful for their past and ongoing stewardship of these lands. And I feel very privileged to be able to live and work here. And this work is definitely aligned with this feeling and commitment to fostering a deeper understanding of how we can work together better, build stronger partnerships. And personally, I'm really interested in how we learn about and continue to amplify Indigenous ways of relating and communicating with each other and our more than human relatives and the land around us. So this webinar series marks the culmination of a research project funded through the National Science Foundation entitled EAGER, Equity in Scientific Co-Production Processes, the creation of a framework led by Rachael at George Mason University. Before jumping into our presentations today, I just want to acknowledge and thank all of the people who have been part of this project along the way, including our partners and staff, our advisory board members, and then all of the folks who participated in the case studies that were part of the research project and participated in the workshop that we hosted as part of this project. And just want to note here that any opinions, findings, or conclusions or recommendations expressed in this webinar are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the views of the National Science Foundation. So we're thrilled to have you all here with us today. This is the first of 4 webinar series exploring insights from research and practice and partnerships focused on equity and co-production. So today we're going to be focused on partnership development. Next week, we'll have a webinar focused on co-production with Indigenous peoples. On Tuesday, July 2nd, we'll be talking about expanding capacity for co-production. And on Wednesday, July 10th, we'll focus on co-production and climate services. This series includes panelists working across a range of institutions and roles who have all submitted articles to a special collection that we organized as part of this project. So the special collection of the journal Community Science, which is focused on equity and co-production, will be published in full by late 2024. So both the work by Cleveland and colleagues and Herman Mercer and colleagues, which you'll hear from today, is already published. So please make sure to check back for additional articles as they're published. There's many more great articles that are in the works as part of this special collection. And I will also make sure to put the link here into the chat. Let me just pull that up. And in addition, if you haven't already, I'll put the links here for the upcoming webinars in the chat as well. And so just I wanted to share a little bit more about the special collection. So the goal of this collection was to showcase successes, best practices, and lessons learned in the design of equitable processes that facilitate co-production or community science, specifically with people who are experiencing barriers due to systemic racism, discrimination, limited access or exclusion from processes. And I want to give a shout out to the editors that have worked with me on this special collection. And I especially want to thank all of our thoughtful reviewers who have been reviewing articles throughout the process of developing this special collection. And to share just a little bit more about the journal, in case you haven't heard about this, Community Science is a relatively new journal. It's a journal of the American Geophysical Union, or AGU, which is focused on community science, which they define as science done together with communities to address community priorities. It's focused on transdisciplinary science with communities, in addition to sharing articles related to scientific theory and methodology. So the journal publishes articles on community science, articles that describe the results of community science, and articles that present scientific findings that are useful for community science. And they accept practice articles, project articles, review articles, and commentaries. And this journal is part of a broader collection that AGU hosts, part of the Community Science Exchange, which also has a place called the Hub, which is a space for sharing resources related to community science and other types of content that are not peer-reviewed journal articles. All right, so before we begin with our presentations from our panelists today, I'd like to just go over a couple housekeeping items. Because this is a webinar, all participants will be on mute. But if you need to make any adjustments, the function should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. This webinar is being recorded and the link will be available for replay, and it'll be emailed out afterward to anybody who registered for the event. For questions specifically directed to our speakers, please use the question and answer feature located within Zoom, and this will help us manage the questions that come in during our Q&A session at the end. And I really wish we had the opportunity to enable all of you to engage with each other. Fortunately, there was a lot of interest in this webinar series, so we did move it from a Zoom meeting to a webinar. And so I just want to acknowledge the fact that I realize relationships and making connections, sharing stories with each other is a really important way to build our knowledge and capacity in this space. And I'm sorry for cutting that feature out of our discussion today. And then finally, just anybody being disruptive or disrespectful in any way will be removed from the webinar immediately. And if you encounter any technical issues, please reach out to Zoom directly. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. So thank you all for sharing with us today, sharing your work. Each panelist is going to give a short presentation to summarize their key findings from their submission to the special collection. And then we'll open it up for discussion. So our first presenter is going to be Katherine Cann, who's at Rutgers University. Our next presenter will be Rachael Cleveland, who did this work as part of her time at University of Hawaii, Manoa. And then Nicole Herman Mercer will be our final presenter for today. And she's with the U.S. Geological Survey Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. So with that, I will turn it over to Katherine.
Okay, thanks so much. Sorry, I got my share before I unmuted. Everything seeing okay? Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to be a part of this webinar series, and I'm really excited to engage in the conversations today. But I'm here on behalf of a group of colleagues at Rutgers University and at CC Run, the Consortium for Climate Risk in the Urban Northeast, which is a NOAA CAP formerly RESA project in the Northeast region, to present today on lessons learned from a pilot small grants program that we ran beginning in the summer of 2022, which emphasized forming equitable co-production between community-based organizations and university researchers in their area. So there we go. So we began with a very simple research question as we were formulating this grant program in the spring of 2022. How can we design a grant competition to advance equitable co-production and climate justice? Co-production and climate justice were our two primary aims within the grant program. We were really emphasizing partnership. But within this research question, I want to emphasize a couple of qualifications that we immediately recognized. Of course, we had to start with thinking about who we are. We are a group of university-based researchers with access to stable federal funding, and that necessarily brings in some power imbalances to any co-production partnership that we hope to develop. Also, we're thinking about a competition. So it's not a traditional project, which all the partners at the table at the beginning of the project. We had a pot of funding. We were hoping to identify partners through a competition format. And so we had to kind of confront those barriers that typically, you'd hope to have all your partners at the table at the onset. And lastly, climate justice means different things to different folks. There's many different dimensions to be explored within that. So we also had to confront how that might have different meanings to us as grant designers and our project partners. So to begin thinking through this research question, we engaged in a series of iterative learning throughout the grant program. We didn't necessarily have all of these learnings organized at the onset. We kind of continued to reflect as the grant program moved forward. And so to kind of collect those learnings and ground ourselves, we first turned, of course, to the co-production literature, which emphasizes, of course, many challenges that are embedded when forming equitable co-production partnerships. There's never enough time or funding to form these trusting relationships, which take a lot of time and resources. There's often inherent power dynamics and inequalities. And there's also often institutional barriers to management of funding. However, scholars have recognized many solutions or recommendations for improvements to co-production partnerships, including making sure all partners are available at the onset, expectations are set early, and that everyone in the project has decision-making control over funding. In addition to the literature, we also turned to other grant makers who are working on similar projects, both in the region and across the country, through our Manoa CAP partners and other folks who are running similar grant programs. And some of the learnings that I just wanted to highlight that we learned from these folks included making sure that we had a clear and transparent call for proposals, again, setting those expectations early. Supporting applications during the application process, especially for organizations who may not have applied to a similar grant in the past. And also then within the grant period to emphasize storytelling and creative reporting as opposed to maybe a more traditional white paper type format. So from these learnings from the literature and other grant makers, we formed a sort of framework of promising approaches that went throughout the various stages of the grant program, from the design, application, to selection and dispersal, ultimately to the grant running it and reporting. I'm not going to run through all of these in the interest of time, but happy to come back to these in the question and answer session if anyone has specific questions. I'll move on to show how we applied this to assessing our small grant program. So just a bit about the small grant program that we ran. It was called the Community Climate Resilience Program, or CCR. And this was 4 small grants, $25,000 spanning 1 year for community-based organizations working on locally led adaptation projects between Philadelphia and Boston. Each grant recipient partnered directly with one CC-run team member who was based at a university near where they were working. And this researcher was there to support a project of the grantee's design. I would encourage folks, if they're interested in learning more about these programs specifically, to visit a link, and I can throw that in the chat after my presentation. So, excuse me. So when we got into the grant phase, we began a formal assessment of the Community Climate Resilience Program using that framework that we had kind of been iteratively forming as we worked through the various phases. So I'm just going to, in the interest of time, highlight a couple of things that stood out in our analysis. And again, happy to go back into more detail if folks have questions. So during the design phase, when we were crafting our call for proposals, we developed service areas, and this was in an effort to help potential applicants understand exactly how CC-run researchers might be able to support their project. So kind of laying it out on the table exactly what resources we had available to us, how we might be of help. During the application phase, we kept the application quite simple. And then we also provided access to CC-run researchers during the application phase for any applicant who was interested in co-developing that application from the onset. Again, in an effort to sort of jumpstart the trust building between the research team and potential applicants. During the selection and dispersal phase, we utilized standard university funding process in an effort to get that funding out quickly to our partners. That had mixed success. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And then during the grant phase, one thing that we were really proud of was our quarterly meetings to form a community of practice across the region, with community-based organizations able to join, form this network with each other, share their stories, share their best practices, and also for the CC-run researchers working with other teams to kind of get to know what was going on across the region. This platform was really helpful, and I think really allowed for sharing of stories and kind of bonding and forming this really valuable network through this grant program. I just want to touch briefly on some of the amazing work that our grantees have been doing over the past year and a half, including a lot of community outreach events, engaging with youth, engaging with other populations in their communities, doing a heat walk, tree planting events, some really great work that I encourage folks to check out if they're interested. But we're proud of, and the grant maker perspective, is that we were able to form a lot of institutional connections and connections to additional funding for our grantees through this program, through kind of this continued and new engagement through these co-production partnerships. So returning to and concluding with the analysis that we have put together for this paper, we identified 3 primary barriers to equitable partnerships within our own work and formulated some recommendations if we're to do this grant program in another iteration, or for other grant makers who are designing similar programs emphasizing co-production relationships, equity, climate justice, and adaptation. So the first barrier stood out very clearly for us, and this was difficulty getting funding to our grant partners. There was a lot of arduous paperwork. Because we were using university models, we were reliant on kind of these reimbursement models. And then ultimately in our contracting, we ran into significant intellectual property concerns, which we hadn't confronted before the process because they were kind of standard. We hadn't really worked with the communities in this way as like a vendor through a university. So these problems really came to the fore. So our first recommendation is streamlining funding, especially in small grants, making funding available upfront, and also making sure that these contracts are restructured to allow for intellectual property to lie with our grant partners. The next barrier to equity came in the form of the competition format, which kind of has some inherent equity challenges. And some things that we would do to kind of start to confront that a little bit in future iterations would be to increase the transparency on our call for proposals, including making our rubric public for evaluation. But also there are some fantastic resources out there, including #FixTheForm and the Climate Funders Justice Pledge, which enable applicants to understand the commitments of the grant makers, understand a little bit more of the application process more thoroughly. So we would definitely integrate some of those. And finally, of course, in every co-production partnership, there's limited time and funding to both develop projects and also to form and maintain relationships. So on that first point, we would recommend acknowledging these limitations and promoting realistic funding options within these grant programs. Small grants in particular have the option to kind of fill the gap of grants that in the adaptation space in particular that might not recognize activities such as childcare at meetings, transportation from A to B. And then the second recommendation we have on this point would be to really foster those communities of practice, because again, they were just so valuable to us. But it was difficult for all of our partners to be in the room, even quarterly, a virtual room. So earmarking some amount of funding to ensure participation from all partners would be a way to foster those communities of practice. And I'll end there. Thank you so much. Again, my name is Katherine Cann. There's my email, and I'd just like to thank not only my co-authors, but all the other CC-Run team members, and of course, our CCR program partners. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Katherine. Next, we're going to hear from Rachael Cleveland.
Things looking all right, Kristen?
Yep.
All right, hi everyone. My name is Rachael Cleveland. I did a project while completing my master's degree at the University of Hawaii at Manoa in their Natural Resources and Environmental Management Department. I used fuzzy cognitive mapping paired with structured decision-making to help inform a management problem here in Waianae, Hawaii. So first, for a little bit of background of the relationship of fire on the landscape in Hawaii. Fire isn't a typical process found in Hawaii, unlike a lot of places on the mainland. Typically, it's found in what's been dubbed the grass fire cycle, where essentially an invasive grass species invades a landscape. It leads to this unnatural fuel loading. Then there are reoccurring wildfire incidents that clear out the landscape for native species, which then leads to further invasive grass invasions. And so it's kind of this positive feedback loop of more and more fire occurring. But with some of these challenging decision-making problems, within this context of how do we manage our landscape for fire, another important aspect that's often missed is this participation from stakeholders. And involving stakeholders within the decision-making framework can be really important for a lot of different reasons. Some of the benefits for the decision include being able to really highlight and focus in on that local context. It can also incorporate the needs of the community, those specific needs that get that community buy-in for the project. And it can also build trust between the scientists, the decision makers, and the stakeholders and other folks that are impacted by the decision. It can also benefit the stakeholders because it can encourage knowledge sharing between the stakeholders and the decision makers. And it can also encourage consensus building and collaboration. And so for my project, I started with a framework of structured decision making, which is displayed here. It involves the PROACT cycle. In the interest of time, I won't dive too deeply into this, but I can, of course, answer any questions folks have about structured decision making. But I use this framework to frame the first step, part of my research. So my research project was co-developed with a local wildfire coalition. They call themselves the Waianae Fire Hui. This hui began in early 2020, and then I joined in 2021 to begin my research. It contains a diverse group of members. They are scientists, farmers, landowners, educators. There's some politicians that are involved, some private companies, just a very diverse group of folks. And then they have this mission. Our immediate goal is to reduce fire risk. Our long-term goal is to improve fire management within the Waianae watershed. And so for that first part of my research, using the PROACT cycle as the framework, I conducted 14 interviews over Zoom with Fire Hui members. Those interviews lasted between 15 and 45 minutes, and I was really trying to understand what they valued about the landscape. What were those objectives that they thought were important when they were thinking about the context of their wildfire problem? And so I was able to identify the top 3 ecosystem services that the folks in the Hui cared about. I also was interested in what management alternatives or actions they were thinking about and considering to do. And so I was able to also elicit the top management alternatives that the folks had been considering. And so from that, I was able to elicit that the problem that they're facing is that these wildfires are happening more often and they're preventable. So they are not good for the environment. Their objectives focused a lot on protection, preparedness, and prevention. So kind of all encompassing the different stages of wildfire. And for the ecosystem services specifically, they were focused on biodiversity, spiritual experience, and water resources. The alternatives that folks were thinking about really varied. A lot of them focused on initial attack and wildfire response, so like water access and road access, things like that. But in regards to the prevention activities they were focused on, there were 3 key ones: herbicide use, native species outplanting, and grazing. And for my research, I was a little bit more focused on the prevention side of things, so those were the 3 alternatives that I considered. So as part of this PROACT cycle within structured decision-making, one of the key steps is being able to model the consequences of the actions that you're thinking about taking. And this is ultimately to allow for you to consider the pros and cons of each action you may take to then ultimately come to a decision and figure out what you're going to do. What I did for my project was used a process called fuzzy cognitive mapping. And again, in the interest of time, I won't dive too deeply into what that entails, but I'm happy to answer questions if folks have it. But essentially, you take variables that are a part of a system, and then you connect them together by weighted relationships to be able to describe that system. And so I conducted 3 one-hour workshops over Zoom with the Fire Hui members in order to create those systems, one for each ecosystem service: biodiversity, spiritual experience, and water resources. There were 5 total participants for the workshops, 3 in the first, 3 in the second, and 2 in the third. And essentially the participants worked together to create these maps with me as a facilitator. And so I just want to say there are some pretty complex maps incoming. You won't be able to read them, and I won't go into them too in depth, but I did want to show you the resulting maps that were created, but I'll go ahead and kind of summarize them after the end. So this is the biodiversity map. This is the spiritual experience map. And then this is the water resources map that was created within the workshops. And so ultimately here, you can see what's cool about the fuzzy cognitive mapping software is that it can summarize all of that complex information into a way to kind of elicit the pros and cons and compare different actions. And so for all 3 maps, native species outplanting ended up having the most positive benefit to the ecosystem service that the folks were thinking about. And then with herbicide use and grazing, the results were more mixed. So ultimately, with pairing fuzzy cognitive mapping and structured decision-making together, there were quite a few benefits that we found through our research. First off, structured decision-making really helped the Fire Hui clarify what they cared about, and it helped elicit that fire management was this complex issue, but part of a greater whole of this land management system that provided a lot of different benefits that the Fire Hui members were thinking about. And ultimately, it illustrated that the choices that folks are making with how they manage for fire are impacting the different values that people get from the landscape and the different things that they care about. In particular, the fuzzy cognitive mapping modeling process allowed the Hui to create their own models with their own knowledge alongside the researcher facilitation and really just be an integral part of that whole process. And so the models created were incredibly context and site specific and were very well calibrated to the environment found in Hawaii, whereas some other models, sometimes they can be overly complex and not well calibrated to Hawaii. And so the Hui participants were really just able to leverage their own knowledge and experiences to inform all stages of the decision-making process. And they were really able to build that trust between the decision makers and the model creators and themselves. The modeling also offered just different insights for management options that benefited multiple objectives. With these complex systems that we're dealing with, it's not always evident what actions, how they will impact the system, and where there are options for multiple benefits happening at the same time. So it helped highlight pathways where that could occur. I did want to emphasize a couple of limitations. Of course, the first one being the workshop size was much smaller than the participants for the interviews, just due to time constraints and schedule conflicts. And so I wasn't able to capture as much as I was from the interviews. And then I also want to note that the Fire Hui had a history. They were working for about a year before I came in, and so that could have impacted the results as well. So ultimately, when I was in grad school, I was noticing that a lot of conservation research struggled to go to or move on to conservation action. And a lot of these issues involve money, uncertainty, context, things not being specific to the context of the problem. They're complex. And then there's also this lack of trust between the stakeholders and the decision makers. And so what I found was using fuzzy cognitive mapping and structured decision making. Those were two tools that really helped tackle a lot of these problems because they are free. They're generally, are able to tackle uncertainty. They are very context specific and can be fine tuned to the situation at hand. They're overall pretty simple to use and easy to learn how to use. And then of course, stakeholder engagement is a part of the process from beginning to end. And so together, fuzzy cognitive mapping and structured decision making were able to help move us from conservation research to conservation action. And so with that, I just wanted to say a huge mahalo nui loa to the folks that helped me conduct this research, as well as the Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization, who was the main co-producer for this project. So thank you.
All right, and finally, we'll turn it over next to Nicole, Herman, Mercer. And for those of you listening in, we'll go to discussion after Nicole's presentation.
Okay, great. Can you see my screen there?
Yep.
Great. Okay, hi everyone. I want to thank you so much, Kristen, for inviting me to speak as part of this webinar series. I'm going to talk today about the paper that we published in this special issue, which is called the Arctic Rivers Project, using an equitable co-production framework for integrating meaningful community engagement and science to understand climate impacts. So before I dig in, I wanted to just say a little bit about me. My name is Nicole Herman Mercer. I'm a research social scientist with the U.S. Geological Survey at the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. I was born and raised in Colorado, which is the ancestral homeland of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute, as well as many other groups who have made their home here in the past and continue to make their home here today. And I've been lucky enough to continue to live in Colorado with my husband and our 2 teenage children. I've been with the USGS for 15 years, and most of that time has been spent working with Alaska Native villages to better understand how climate change impacts are really impacting the social systems of these communities, as well as practicing participatory science from community-based monitoring, as well as attempting full-scale knowledge co-production, which is what I'll talk about a little bit today. All of this work has primarily taken place in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta region of Alaska, which is on the western subarctic. The image that's shown on this slide is my all-time favorite Landsat image of the Yukon River emptying into the Bering Sea. And it's a place that I've been lucky enough to spend a lot of time. So the work I'm going to talk about today is part of the Arctic Rivers Project. The Arctic Rivers Project is a large interdisciplinary project that was funded by the National Science Foundation's Navigating the New Arctic program, and we just started our 5th year. I guess we're halfway through our 5th year now. The objective of this project is really to increase collective understanding of climate change impacts on rivers, fish, and communities, and to co-produce this understanding with Indigenous communities, Indigenous organizations, federal agencies such as the U.S. Geological Survey, scientific institutions such as the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and U.S. and Canadian-based universities, including our primary university, the University of Colorado at Boulder. So the project study domain is really the entire state of Alaska, with a focus on the Yukon River watershed. You can see this is a really large area, and in addition to being a large geographic space, it's also a very culturally diverse space and is home to 229 federally recognized tribes. In addition to the size of the study area, we have a pretty large team with scientists that are trained in anthropology, hydrology, atmospheric sciences, and biology, using a lot of different methods to help meet our objective. So in order to attempt to co-produce a project at this scale, we started by partnering with a frequent collaborator of mine, the Yukon River Intertribal Watershed Council, to develop a research question and a proposal. So the Yukon River Intertribal Watershed Council represents nearly all of the tribes and First Nations in the Yukon watershed, and the directives for its scientific projects are formulated based on adopted resolutions from the Watershed Council leadership. So at the Watershed Council's 11th Biennial Summit meeting that took place in 2019, the leadership directed their science department to address climate change impacts on water quantity, quality, and salmon habitat. So together, we developed a research question that was relevant to the Watershed Council leadership, but broad and thereby flexible enough that additional related questions could be developed as we deepened our relationships with specific communities over time. So building on the work of Yua et al., which asserts that communities and researchers must work together to develop processes that are appropriate in order to co-produce knowledge, as well as be intentional and deliberate about what is collectively needed and desired, we formed an Indigenous Advisory Council early in the project to help us co-design a reflexive knowledge co-production framework. And this framework values both the processes that are involved in co-producing as well as the outcomes of co-production. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about the Indigenous Advisory Council and how we work together to develop our co-production framework. So the Indigenous Advisory Council was formed through an open application process in the first year of the project. To be eligible to be a council member, individuals were required to be an enrolled member of an Alaska Native tribe or a Yukon First Nation, or work for organizations representing or serving those groups. Applicants were asked to describe any previous experience they had representing their community, experience or interest in helping their community plan for changes, as well as to describe why they were interested in serving on the council. So the resulting Indigenous Advisory Council is made up of 11 tribal leaders, scholars, and knowledge holders from across our study domain. And you can see some of their photos here, as well as the locations that they represent as these blue diamonds on the slide. So the first thing that we did once the Indigenous Advisory Council was formed was to collectively develop a charter that would guide our work together. And one of the first decisions that we made was that the Indigenous Advisory Council members would be full project team members, as opposed to being a fully outside entity that just provided advice to the rest of the project team. The charter also outlined matters such as the purpose and the tasks of the council, how one qualifies to be a member of the council, participation requirements, the decision-making process, both internally for the council, as well as how the project overall would make decisions based on the council's input. The charter also includes guidelines for engagement to create a safe, respectful, and collaborative environment for all of the team members. And then finally, the process by which the charter could be amended is documented, and the date that the charter was adopted was recorded. So once the charter was established and adopted, we turned our focus to co-designing knowledge co-production protocols for the project to follow. To do this, a student intern that was working on the project at the time, Annie Lawler, conducted a literature review on knowledge co-production. She then summarized the results of that literature review in a report and provided that to our Indigenous Advisory Council, as well as summarized it in a presentation that she delivered at one of our Indigenous Advisory Council meetings. After that presentation, we facilitated an interactive whiteboarding activity where Indigenous Advisory Council members could include processes and activities that they felt should be included in our project as part of knowledge co-production. So then bringing all of these sources together, we developed our knowledge co-production protocols to guide the project. These were then reviewed and adopted by our council and the rest of the project team. The protocols are divided into qualities of co-production for the project to embody, and these qualities really transcend the project and are things that we feel are important for all knowledge co-production projects. And then practices that the team could adopt that lead to practical actions specifically for our project. So the project knowledge co-production protocols document contains a table that looks just like this that describes each of the qualities for the project to seek to embody, as well as the meaning and significance of that quality. These qualities were developed primarily based on that review of the literature that Annie conducted, and they really emphasize the necessity of framing equity throughout all of the stages of the research project. So thinking about things like trust and respect and warmth, gratitude, accountability, open-mindedness, adaptiveness, as well as honesty and transparency and humility. The practices of knowledge co-production were driven more by the Indigenous Advisory Council and the research team, thinking about project-specific measures and tools we could use. So the resulting protocols then defines each of these practices that are shown here and then outlines how the project team can implement that practice through specific actions. So for example, establishing effective communication by using a variety of communication methods, including and protecting Indigenous knowledge throughout the project by developing protocols with the communities we're working with about what Indigenous knowledge can be shared and what cannot be shared. Altering the decision-making process by adhering to community protocols, and practicing cultural awareness and education by requiring the project team members to receive cultural awareness training. So the framework for knowledge co-production that we developed with our Indigenous Advisory Council is really premised on the belief that equity must be the foundation of co-production. Given that, and the practices outlined in our protocols and in the activities undertaken thus far by the project, we've really endeavored to give our Indigenous Advisory Council equal decision-making authority, and in some cases, such as the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge, higher decision-making authority. We've also found that institutional and community capacity are really crucial and the main resources needed to successfully co-produce knowledge. And this is a point that's reflected in much of the literature on co-production. For this project, we're constantly running up against institutional and community constraints, from how to compensate individuals for attending meetings, all the way to how to co-author this paper together. Many of our council members do not have institutional affiliations, and we're required to complete sometimes confusing electronic forms to be listed as authors on the paper. That said, knowledge co-production really provides a pathway to help us transition science from demand-relevant research toward demand-driven research that can provide useful, usable, and used data to help communities adapt to the changes that they're facing. Therefore, it really behooves all of us to work to dismantle these institutional barriers where we find them and to support community capacity in order to boost knowledge co-production. And so with that, I want to thank you again for having me here today. I want to acknowledge all of the co-authors, which consists of the project team, as well as all of our Indigenous Advisory Council members. And I also wanted to acknowledge Carolina Behe, Rachael Daniels, and Julie Raymond-Jacobian, whose work on co-production of knowledge really influenced a lot of our project's thinking. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you all for those presentations. Those were wonderful. Lots of great shout outs coming through in the question and answer area as well. So we have some time for questions from the audience, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. Before we dive into the discussion today, I'd just like to introduce this concept of step up and step back. So that means if you have a lot of opportunities to ask questions in this setting, please consider stepping back to give others a chance to ask questions and contribute. And conversely, if you tend to be quieter, we encourage you to step up and share your thoughts, especially people who are from underrepresented groups in science. We want to encourage you to ask your questions because it can really help us shed light on issues that we might not have otherwise considered, and that can drive our conversation here in really important directions. So I see several questions coming up. Please use the thumbs up icon in the question and answer area to upvote any questions that you would really love to see answered. And I think we'll start with this first question here from Seamus. Wonderful presentations. Can any of you share experiences with co-production or participatory burnout, or instances where the effort it takes to build good relationships and coordinate this deeper work can tax the capacity of participants, many of whom often have capacity gaps to begin with? As we see more projects like this popping up, how can we prevent or address this?
I can start. So I'll just speak to this project specifically. I think that we were cognizant that that was a real possibility. We met with our Indigenous Advisory Council at the beginning monthly for 2 hours, and we were deliberate in the things that we asked them to weigh in on. So the matters that were going to be really relevant to the overall direction of the project were things that we sought feedback on, like these co-production protocols. And then we sort of left other smaller decisions, like what kind of water temperature sensors to use, to the researchers that were doing that kind of work. I think that, and we also recognized that people were not going to come to every single meeting, that they had other things going on. And so, yeah, we tried to be really conscious of that as well.
Yeah, I can chime in on this. Part of my intent in joining the WHOI about a year before the research really fully went underway was part of that recognition and wanting the WHOI to lead the work, and why I initially spoke just with the nonprofit Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization, to ensure that whatever project I presented to them was something that would be of value to the group as well. And I also had developed, when I was conducting my interviews, like an expedited version. That's why there was a bit of a range. 15 to 45 minutes was to acknowledge that not everyone can sit down with me for an hour and talk. And so trying to keep being cognizant of folks' time and not asking too much of them. I think as projects continue, and capacity is always going to be this limiting factor, I think what can help is ensuring that the participants see the value in what you're doing. So rather than just bringing a project and saying, hey, wouldn't this be great? Give me 40 hours of your time over the next 3 months. If you're co-developing it, then they have the buy-in because they see the value in it too. So it's less of an ask and more of a like, yes, I would love to participate. And I got that feedback with a lot of the participants being really excited about learning how to use the fuzzy cognitive mapping and participating in the project. So I think it's something to consider. And I guess the way forward that I see would be just ensuring that your hand isn't just out asking for something, and making sure that it's a reciprocal relationship, that they're getting something out of it too. So it feels less of a greater ask and more of a, we're going to do this together.
I would echo what Nicole and Rachel have added, but just one additional thing is just the need to maintain flexibility within our grant program. We saw a lot of turnover within our grantee organizations, so because oftentimes they were very small, and so that would kind of change the momentum of the projects we were working on with them, and also require us to kind of form relationships with new people. So that just required us to be flexible, and I think also maintain a flexible vision of our timeline. So instead of having kind of these strict timelines of when things were expected to be completed, just making sure that we were able to kind of have a more fluid idea of kind of the project to enable our results to be more flexible.
All right, I think next we'll go to this question from Michelle, also for all of the speakers. How do you identify which community members or leaders represent the perspective of the community?
I can continue. I can start again. I mean, in a lot of my work, you have to sort of rely on the folks that you know within the community to be recommending folks for you to talk to that are believed to be trusted and representative sort of knowledge holders or leaders within the community. So I think that there's, in a lot of like the qualitative work that I do, there's reliance on those community partners as well as on the tribal council if you're working with a tribe. For our project and identifying the Indigenous Advisory Council members, it was sort of, many of them are already representing their communities, and so that was part of like the application process to learn more about the work and the experiences that they were already doing. So many of them were already leaders that were doing work in addition to our project to represent their communities. And so that sort of helped us have confidence that they were the appropriate person. I will also say that most of the time people will tell you, like, I don't speak on behalf of my community. And so there is, sometimes they'll say, in this case, I am speaking on behalf of my community. In this case, I'm speaking on behalf of myself. And so also like being aware of that.
Yeah, I can echo that and just say that in my particular case, one of my co-principal investigators had been working with the Hui far longer than I had before I had joined the university, and so he had that knowledge of who to go to, and ultimately we went to the facilitator of the Hui, which was the Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization, and so working with them, they were able, because they helped create and facilitate the group, they were able to kind of act on its behalf and reflect the best interest of the group.
And I see two questions here. Katherine, did you want to comment on that one? Otherwise, I'll go to the next question. Okay, so I'm going to present these two together. So there's a question from Julie about, did you pay your Indigenous advisor circle? If yes, how did you decide appropriate amount for payment? So I believe that question could be probably relevant in all of these contexts, but then also another interesting, somewhat related question from Katya. How can you overcome inherent inequitable institutional power dynamics where universities and professors handle the money? Frequent challenges we hear about in co-production.
Yeah, I can answer for the Indigenous Advisory Council. We paid our council for every meeting that they attended. And yeah, that was handled by the university. And so I think they were set up as like consultants with the university is how that was handled, but I worked for the USGS. I was like not involved in any of those pieces other than making sure that we were compensating people for their time. And the way that we decided on the amount was sort of like what we knew from experience with best practices, as well as like asking some of our colleagues and other kind of leaders in this space what they recommended as an appropriate amount.
And I'll jump in also in our grant competition context. This was handled through the universities. Our community-based organizations were brought on as vendors. And I spoke a bit in my presentation about some of the challenges we face there, major intellectual property concerns within some of the standard contracts that we needed to confront. Also reliance on a reimbursement model that I think we weren't able to address in this round, that I think would work to get upfront funding for our partners in the future. As kind of just starting to challenge some of these, but we also built into our funding call that our partners had quite a lot of flexibility in spending the funds on what their activities, how they deemed those activities to be appropriate to suit their projects. So that was completely, their budget was completely led by them. We didn't have oversight on that, or limited rather. So we kind of worked with them at the onset to get that going, so they had more control over the funding.
So for my project, we didn't compensate anyone for their participation, but most of my involvement was attending the WHOI meetings that were already scheduled. And the only additional ask was the one-on-one interviews, as well as participation in the workshop. And so because I couldn't offer any sort of compensation, I just tried to respect folks' time and really shorten the amount of time that I was asking of them as best as I could.
All right, let's see. So it looks like maybe we have time for one more question. So this is from Isaac, and they ask, have any of you interacted with community members who downplayed the impacts of climate change or denied them entirely? If so, how did that impact researchers' mission of reciprocal community engagement? Did you simply move past those individuals, or did you seek to build consensus? I'm curious how knowledge co-production and community-led research intersects with local doubt of the necessity of climate action. So in this case, climate kind of maybe touches some of these projects more than others, but perhaps you can answer that more broadly as well about finding common ground if climate is not the most salient topic.
Sure. So our project obviously is very specifically focused on climate change and climate impacts. And so I would say that it's sort of been like this tiered process for our project, like the partners that we worked with, the Yukon River Intertribal Watershed Council, to develop the project proposal, are concerned with climate change. And so that wasn't an issue. When I work in communities, which we are going to be doing as the final stage for this project this summer, I actually don't talk about climate change. I talk about environmental change. I talk about hazardous impacts and weather events and those sorts of things, because I don't want to narrow people's focus about what they may think I mean when I say climate change. And I also don't want to exclude anybody from the conversation that may not think that the environmental changes they're seeing are related to climate change, which they may or may not be, right? And so I pretty explicitly try to just avoid having that conversation that can become a more political or personal conversation, because we really want to understand the experiences overall, and what we call those experiences sort of doesn't matter.
So for my project, climate change didn't really come up a whole lot, I guess because of the unique system in Hawaii where the wildfires are certainly driven by climate change, but it's really that grass fire cycle that folks were particularly concerned about. However, there was some contention with herbicide use, and I thought something that was really interesting that came from this project is it gave the opportunity for landowners and farmers to speak directly with scientists about how herbicide use can be applied in a way that limits the impacts to the environment. So there was actually a bit of knowledge sharing that occurred for that group where experts who used herbicides were able to explain how they use them and how they can limit the negative impacts of herbicide use, and it was able to help the farmers come to terms with that and see that point of view. So in that end, this participatory framework and co-production can help, I think, facilitate knowledge sharing and help build consensus with some of these maybe more controversial topics.
I would echo what's already been said with paying attention to vocabulary, using terms like resilience, which we find is really salient with a lot of the groups that we work with, which is not necessarily specifically focused on climate change. I wouldn't say this was an issue in our grant program since we were tracking applications from organizations who were working on adaptation specifically. So they were focused on climate, but in their community outreach, I know that they also alter their vocabulary and focus on kind of erosion or other like very site-specific topics to kind of garner engagement in this maybe more controversial area of climate change.
All right. Well, I think we are out of time for additional questions. So just to wrap up today, thank you all for attending. Thank you so much to all of our presenters. And thank you to the National Science Foundation for supporting this work and everybody who's been engaged in this project. The webinar recording will be available over email shortly. And please make sure to check out Community Science to read the submissions to the special collection and check back throughout this year as additional articles will be published. And then also don't forget to register for these upcoming events. Next week, we'll be hearing from Margaret Rudolph and Elizabeth Figus on co-production with Indigenous peoples. On Tuesday, July 2nd, expanding capacity for co-production, and then Wednesday, July 10th, co-production and climate services. So thank you all again for attending. We look forward to seeing you in the future. And yeah, big round of applause for all of our presenters today.